So again, welcome everyone. We're very happy to have all of you here. We have a very exciting PDW set up for you. My name is Ben King, and I just want to kind of again go over welcome. If you are in the right place, if you're here for possibly the best survey methods PDW. We'll be talking about designing, implementing surveys, collecting individual and firm level data. Our sponsor is Strategy. And Evan and I guess, as I mentioned, are the organizers. We have some very fine panelists here who are going to each be taking turns discussing. Evan Starr, who as a colleague of mine at the University of Maryland, has worked a lot on implementing surveys with panel providers to find data on individuals, specifically those who sign and don't sign post-employment restrictive covenants. Mike Roach, who has done surveys, especially with university entrepreneurs and scientists. Christina, who's done a lot of, Christina has done a lot of work on surveys. Oh, excuse me, hold up. I apologize. It's a little, I don't know why it's a little glitchy here. Okay, I'm sorry. Are you? Oh, geez. Okay, it's not a Zoom meeting. If something weird doesn't happen, my apologies. We have Christina McElloran. Darn it all. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing you very well. My apologies. But Christina has done a lot of work on the annual business survey, working with Census Bureau data. Karen Hoisel, Alfonso Gambardella are listed as participants. I think we'll hear from Karen today, who's done a lot of work on the PATVAL survey and innovation, European technology. And Danielle, who's worked on the World Management Survey, among other things, looking at firms' best management practices. And so anyway, so we have a lot of great panelists. I'm going to go ahead and try and turn the time over to our first one. Let me just briefly see if I can't get back to my screen share. Okay, here we are. Okay, so our agenda again is looking at the how-to, when to use survey methods, best practices, as well as an interactive opportunity at the end. For those who have signed up for the breakout session. We have our public session, which is now for the next 90 minutes. We're going to do an overview of survey methods. Karen, I think, is going to start off. Then we'll have Evan present. He'll talk about cost benefits, survey design. And then I think we're going to do Christina, Mike, and Daniela. Although if you guys wanted to switch up the order, I heard you might want to do that, Christina. By all means, feel free to do so. At the end, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. And then for those who have kind of signed up, we have a breakout session for the last 25, 30 minutes or so. Those who have pre-registered will discuss in small breakout rooms with pre-submitted questions. We haven't had too many people sign up though, so there are some free slots. If you would like to message me through Zoom in the chat feature privately, we might be able to slide you in with the breakout groups. Okay. Thank you for participating, and I will go ahead and turn the time over to Karen to get things started.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. So I tried to share my slides. Okay, try to get to the presenters mode. So can you see my slides now? Wonderful. So again, thanks a lot for inviting me. So I was asked to talk about survey methods in general, and in particular about why survey methods are useful or under which conditions they can be useful for strategy research. So I want to start with a definition of survey methods, because once people think about surveys, they often have a very dusty, old-fashioned methodology in mind. And they think about people sitting on piles of paper questionnaires with a lot of useless questions inside. but it's not what survey methods is about. So survey methods is actually a very powerful research methodology. It's for, of course, collecting data, but what is especially powerful about this methodology is that you can get information which you cannot get from other data sets. And I will give you a number of examples in the following, and hopefully at the end you're fully convinced that this is the way to collect your data in the future. So there are a number of different approaches that you can use. It's not only about paper questionnaires or online questionnaires. You can, of course, also conduct interviews. So do not talk about exploratory interviews now. I mean, interviews with at least a guideline, so with questions in the background. And these interviews can, of course, be done in person, via telephone. Today, we would probably use Zoom. But you could also do more than that. You can use digital media. So in the era of digitalization, you can also use social networks. You can use the QR codes. You can just email out things. But of course, you have to deal with the costs, because if you use these types of surveys, then you lose part of the control. So for example, in the end, you have to think about whether you still know what your population are, or what your results are representative for. So it's about costs, of course. Now, the question, how can surveys be helpful in strategy research? So here my answer is kind of a little bit special, because I think it's not about strategy versus orga versus innovation. The question that is actually important is whether you have a research question that fits survey methodology, whether you can find people who can answer your questions convincingly, and whether you can find people who want to give you an answer. Because the one thing is that there are people out there, like CEOs, for example, or venture capitalists, that would have your answer, but the question is, would they answer an online questionnaire, for example? So would you get a response rate that is enough to get valuable results? So I would rather like to talk about research questions in general, which research questions fit a survey design. So typically, if you conduct a survey, then you talk to people. Most of the cases, you talk to one particular person, and therefore it is easier to answer individual level questions compared to firm level and team level, because firms cannot answer, teams cannot answer. Of course, you can ask more than one person out of a team, but then it becomes very complex, very costly. So it does work for other levels of analysis as well, but individual level questions are the easiest probably. Then, of course, you have to keep in mind that if you conduct a survey, then most of the cases, it's cross-sectional data that you get. I mean, Michael will probably talk about his panel later on. So it is possible to get time series data or to get panel data, but then it becomes even more costly. And I will also show you or give you an example later on how you can kind of get to a compromise. But in most of the cases, you get cross-sectional data. Surveys are particularly relevant if you have very complex relationships. So if you need a lot of control variables. To give you an example, if you want to analyze organizational creativity, then you probably all have these very complex models of Amabile in mind. And then you need all these control variables. And it's very hard to get these controls from other data sources. If you want to get down to the mechanism, so if you want to analyze if you want to answer the why question, then surveys could also be very interesting, because once it's about mechanisms, then you often need information about motives, about preferences, and these are data or information that you cannot get from other sources. Contingency analysis also work very well for survey designs. So contingency analysis, contributions where actually no contributions left. So if all the questions have already been answered, then find mediators or moderators and design a new contribution. And again, you would get the information from a survey. The degree of novelty is probably also something we should talk about. So in the end, you can, of course, answer novel questions, but if it's totally exploratory, then a survey design is difficult, because a survey means that you need a certain question. So you have to formulate questions beforehand. It's not like you talk to people, and while talking to people, you find out about something. You have to formulate questions beforehand, irrespective of which methodology you use in the end. And if you don't know what to ask, then a survey doesn't work. And so what you need is a fit between the question and the methodology, and then it could be very valuable. This brings me to the sorry, to the next question: theory building versus theory testing. And most of you have probably already seen this figure. So it's one that we use in our courses typically. So it's taxonomy to capture empirical articles theoretical contribution, and on the x-axis you have theory testing, and on the y-axis theory building. I think, and the gray part is a small theoretical contribution, and the white part of the figure is a large theoretical contribution. I think we do not have to talk about theory testing, because theory testing is definitely something you can do with a survey design. So it's probably more about theory building, where we have to think about whether it's doable or not. And as you can see, there are different types of theory building. And of course, the ones with the low contribution are, for example, replications of existing studies. That's for sure possible with survey designs. Empirical tests of effects that have not been tested before. As long as you know which effect to test and which questions to ask, you can do it with a survey design. New moderators and mediators, I mentioned that already. As long as you know which relationships you should test, then it works well. But the other two, 4 and 5, so new relationships between existing constructs or new constructs, that's more difficult. Because what you normally use in order to build these new theories is, for example, an inductive approach, like a case study, or you use a grounded theory. And then in most of the cases, you do not exactly know ex ante what to ask, and then a survey design comes to its limits. The next thing I want to do is to give you an example, because what I did together with Alfonso Gambardella, amongst others, Dietmar Hauf, Miriam Mariani, and there were more, is 2 large inventor surveys. The first one, Patwal EU6 or Patwal 1, was conducted in 2003 and 4, and then Patwal 2 or InnoSNT in 2009 to 2011. And I want to share with you a few experiences from these surveys, and also a few learnings. So for Patwal 1, we contacted almost 30,000 inventors in 6 European countries. And what we did is we surveyed the first individual listed on the patent, and we only surveyed inventors on granted patents. And this, of course, was a huge problem exposed, of course. So at the time we did it, we didn't know. But reviewers really didn't believe us that the order of the inventors on a patent does not have a meaning. So we conducted a number of interviews with patent attorneys, companies, and we always came to the same conclusion: there is no meaning, but the reviewers just didn't believe it. The reason why we sampled granted patents is that we wanted to, in Patwal 1, we wanted to oversample important patents because we wanted to find out more about patent value. And the reviewers were fine with oversampling important patents, like the highly cited ones, but they did not buy this granted patent selection issue. So they said, okay, this is a selection issue, and it's not only about value, there might be other things going on, and therefore this was also not a good idea. Part of the countries, so the survey was done in 6 countries in parallel. Part of the countries like Italy, for example, they conducted telephone interviews with the inventors. In Germany, we sent out paper questionnaires because at that time, inventors did not really use the internet. We had no email addresses, so it was not possible to send out links. So we sent out more than 15,000 paper questionnaires. And we stuffed a Volkswagen Golf with envelopes, and the postage fees almost ruined us because it was just too expensive, and the return postage was even more expensive. It was horrible, but in the end, it paid off. So we got, all in all, we got 9,000 answers from inventors. The response rate was quite high at that time, 33% for surveys okay. And we got all the information that we could not get from other sources, like information about the individual education, employment, mobility, invention processes, rewards, and patent value. The whole thing was sponsored by the European Commission because surveys, even though they are super valuable and super powerful, they are expensive. And we got 130,000 euros from the European Commission, but we subsidized the research. So all the different countries added more resources. Then in Patwal 2, We learned from Pitfalls 1. So first of all, we extended the number of countries. Then now we conducted a survey in 20 European countries, in Israel, the US, and Japan. We contacted more than 120,000 inventors, and this time we randomly selected the inventor listed on the patent, and we used all patents, also patent applications, so not only granted patents. We used an online questionnaire in 6 languages, and in the end we got 23,000 answers. Same type of information, even though the questionnaire was more focused. And again, we got money from the European Commission, more than 600,000 euros this time. And again, we had to subsidize it, and it was extremely expensive. One of the people who are registered for the second part of the PDW asked how to deal with different countries and how to make sure that the questions are comparable across countries, or the answers are comparable across countries. And actually, this was exactly one of the things that bothered us a lot. So my quick answer to this question is that, first of all, we needed partners. I mean, in Europe, we could do it by ourselves, more or less, because the cultures are more or less similar. But we needed partners, especially in the US and in Japan. And there we had partners. If I would do it again, I would also find a partner in Israel, but we thought we could do it, but the response rate was very low in the end. And in terms of comparability, you have 2 options actually. One option is to restrict the question to topics that work for all countries, but that might be too restrictive at some point. And what you could also do, and this is what we did in Pitfalls 1, for example, is add country-specific sections. So then it's a combination of both. Now, what I did in my dissertation thesis part, based on Pitfalls 1, and then I also extended it with Pitfalls 2 data, is as research on inventor mobility. And I do not want to go into detail here, but of course, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer the questions afterwards. But here, survey data were essential. So there are things that you cannot get from other sources. And here, one example is something that is hard to get is the date of the move, because you can use patent data and publication data and make a few assumptions, but in the end, it is very difficult to nail it down to one particular year, for example. And if you do not have employer-employee match data, so the last column, then it's almost impossible to get this information. And the same applies to all the explanatory variables about the education of the inventors, the job histories, and especially the motives, the reasons why the person moved from one employer to another, the reason why the inventor selected the new employer. So this is information that is not available in any other data source. The disadvantage, of course, is the panel structure, which is not there. So if you want to do a different diff, you first of all need a panel, and second, you need a control group. Control group of non-movers is not an issue, but the panel structure is an issue. And an identification strategy. So you typically need an instrument, or you try to design the survey around a certain shop. This is not what we did, so we had to find instruments. Objectivity is a problem, especially if you are interested, like me, you're interested in the causality between mobility and productivity. Then you ask the inventor about his productivity, and then it's always biased. I mean, it's not an issue if all the inventors just overestimate their productivity and they do it in a systematic way. If it's not systematic with respect to your research question, then it doesn't matter. Otherwise, it is a problem. So again, what is the solution? The solution is combine different data sources. So get all the information that you can get from a survey and combine it with another data set that solves all the issues of the survey data. For example, this is what I did. I combined survey data with patent data. You can combine it with publication data, or if confidentiality issues allow it, you can also do it with the registry data. And then you get the time structure, then you get the objective productivity measures and everything you need. So I said before that what you need, besides a research question that fits a survey design, is people who want to answer your questions and who can answer your questions. So the first thing was easy because inventors had not been asked before, and they were happy to share all the information about their inventions with us. So they even phoned us afterwards to tell us more. That was cool. Nowadays, they would probably not do the same because in the meantime, they have been bothered with questionnaires too much. The other question was, can they say something about the value of their patents? If you ask the inventors, they always say yes. If you ask the reviewers, they will always say no. So we had a good answer to this question because the compensation the inventors get is based on the value of the patents. And this is why inventors who get an inventor compensation know about the monetary value. What we would not have assumed is that they know anything about, for example, commercialization strategies, or at least they do not know enough in order to use it as a variable. But monetary value is fine. So this is my last slide. What if we decided to do Pitfall 3? So what would I do differently? First of all, I would probably think about killing myself, but then of course, in the end, I would happily do it. And I would probably add China and India, maybe a few more countries. I would try to add inventors without patents, because this is one of the critiques that we got all the time. So maybe people from, or researchers from publications, but maybe also people from other databases, from project databases, for example, even without any patents or publications at all. I would go back to an approach where I would oversample subgroups of interest, like female inventors, for example. I would try to survey teams, not whole teams, but maybe 2 persons or 2 people out of a team, and then create diets. I would try to add a time structure, not a panel for sure, that would be too costly, but I would, for example, try to add something like a biographic calendar. So where you take a different time window and then you subdivide it into different year bundles, and then you ask about 3 or 4 year time windows. So for example, whether they moved or were specialized or whatever, work for large, small firms and so on. I would try to think more about identification, find better instruments than we did last time. And I would also try to combine the survey with other data collection methods like experiments. It is super easy to add an experiment to a survey. For example, just design 2 questionnaires and assign people randomly. I did that before, and this was also one of the questions by the people. Can you add a conjoint experiment? Yes, you can, and I did it repeatedly, and that's also very powerful methodology, combined survey and a conjoint experiment. I would focus more in order to not to bother people too much with 20 pages of questionnaires. And I would try at least to derive concrete hypotheses and not just research question before I start the survey. Because if you just have research question, then you get add everything that might be useful, and in the end, you forget 50% of what you actually need. But if you have concrete hypotheses, then it will work. So the message is, it's a powerful methodology if it fits, if you find the right people who can and want to answer your questionnaire. And what you should do is you should combine it with other data sources and with other methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. We'll now turn the time over to Evan Starr. Evan, you're up.
Wow, thank you so much, Karen. Just fantastic, and I hope you do Pitfall 3. I think we need it. Okay, let me share my screen, and okay, can everybody see everything? Okay. Okay, all right. So welcome and thank you to Ben for really doing most of the organizing here and letting me tag along. And thanks to my panelists, my fellow survey people. So what I want to do is piggyback a little bit on what Karen said. I want to talk about why you might ever consider developing or implementing your own survey, some of the costs and benefits and how to do it, and then really some of the pitfalls that come in survey development and data cleaning and the publication process. So let me just begin with why you should consider this. Well, I think the first is that, as Karen pointed out, a survey really allows you to gather information that you can't get any other way. You know, we have lots of sources of public data, but talking to someone, understanding the reality of their world and being able to craft the questions, it's like an interview on a mass scale, and you get to ask the questions. And so, you know, surveys allow you to gather information that nobody's really gathered before. And of course, you know, the public available data may be totally insufficient to really establish main facts or relationships, let alone several of the mechanisms that you care about. I think especially for junior researchers or grad students, when you have a proprietary survey data, it also gives you a resource that nobody else has, you know, that you can exploit going forward. And so if we're thinking about applying kind of the resource-based use style to our own strategy research, or to our own research, then this is one way to give yourself a little bit of an advantage. So I think the incentives here are strong. I want to say a little bit about my story and how I got into this. When I was in grad school, I was reading this research on non-compete agreements and this kind of long debate on how we should think about non-compete agreements. If you don't know what those are contracts that would say that you can't leave your firm and join a competitor. And there's a really long legal debate over non-compete, 600 years, where courts have been trying to decide what, should we enforce them? Should we not enforce them? Under what circumstances? The debate is all encompassing. You've got people saying Silicon Valley arose because of California's ban on non-competes. You've got people saying non-competes are modern day slavery. And then you've got a whole bunch of organizational economist theories saying that, yeah, well, like non-competes are definitely really good because workers wouldn't agree to them otherwise, and they solve holdup problems. And I just thought, like, wow, like this is really interesting. There's lots of really interesting questions going back a long time, but there's really very limited data on actual non-competes. I mean, at this time I was reading this, like Matt Marks 2011 was basically the only study of actual non-competes, and he did a survey of engineers, but there was no broader evidence testing against these competing theories. And so, so some of the questions I was interested in that we didn't have answers to was just how common are non-compete agreements? There were anecdotes of bartenders signing them, of hairstylists, but like, did we really know? Which of these theories were right? There was arguments that, even unenforceable non-competes exist and that they chill worker mobility. Do we have any evidence of that? In the US, at least, non-compete agreements are enforced by the state, and states have very different policies. So you might wonder, like, do workers even know what the law is? People tend to assume that they do, but is that right? It turns out it's not. There's also discussions about externalities about non-compete agreements, right? A non-compete is a contract signed between two parties, but it has implications for potentially other people. But what do those look like? And then, of course, non-compete is just one part of an employment contract. Maybe there are other types of provisions that also matter similarly. And so in my view, when I was in graduate school, surveys really seemed like the most natural questions to answer all of these questions. And so what I did is I developed a survey at the end of graduate school with a few advisors. It's been now 7 years since I collected that data. And in that time, we published 7 papers that partially or entirely relied on that data set, including 2 working papers. I could have never envisioned, how all of it would have come together when I first wrote these things, but it has given me a great resource to just use over and over again in ways that I didn't anticipate. Some I didn't anticipate initially, but others that I didn't. Here's my greatest hit, you guys. I felt like I can do a humble brag now. So when I got to testify in front of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, I was expecting them to like ask me for my numbers, and tell me like, Evan, tell us what's going on with non-competes. Okay, great. But that's not what happened. They then cited my statistics back to me in my unpublished working papers. And it was surreal, you guys, I have to say, like, it was crazy. Now, the fact that the papers are unpublished is the story that I want to get to at the end here. So we'll get there. Okay, so, and Ben and I have a recent survey, which is the impetus of this PDW, about understanding the entrepreneurship and mobility process. And so, questions we're asking here are, what percentage of workers have business ideas? Which workers decide to pursue which ideas in a new firm versus an existing firm? What is that process like? Why do some drop out at each stage of the process? Which theories of startup formation, if you think about kind of a Klepperian view of strategic disagreements, or sort of an Anton Yao view of appropriability, which of those appear most consistent with the data? And then if you think about entrepreneurship as a career choice versus just joining a new firm, what are the precise differences between those two processes, and how do they differ for the impacts on the workers and even on their source firms? So some of those questions have been addressed with other data sets, but you can see the value of a survey here and just asking workers about their business ideas and what they did. So how do you think about developing and implementing a survey? I just want to say a few points here. The first thing is to think about who you're going to sample, what's your population of interest, and then internal validity. So, so who's your population is really, really important. You want to make sure, ideally you collect a random sample of this population, right? That's going to help you get your inference right when you think about p-values and whatnot. It's probably not going to be a random sample that you get, but you need to know that this is my target population that I'm trying to sample. The second one is, how are you going to reach them? So Karen did an excellent job. I can't imagine sending out all of those pieces of paper and then handling all the return mail. I can't even handle the mail in my own house, let alone like 9,000 individual surveys coming back. I think with the advent of the internet, most surveying is done online now, at least all the political surveying in the US, and that has just changed the whole face of the survey world. It's made it just incredibly cheap to reach people. And so, but of course there are costs with online surveys, and I'll talk about some of those in just a minute. How are you going to ensure that enough of them actually respond to your survey? This is a crucial question. And then how are you going to ensure that they actually give you valid information? Okay, so here things to think about are things like priming effects. If you lead with one question, how is that going to change how they answer a second question? And then of course, just testing your questions to make sure that people actually understand what you're talking about. Because if you don't give them an option to say I don't know or I don't understand, then you're just going to get garbage. Okay, so what I've done in the past is I've run several different surveys, some through companies that have helped me do the surveying, some where I'm partnering with a private organization. I've worked with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The ones I want to talk about now, I think, are the most applicable to the participants here, and these are with Qualtrics and Dynata. And essentially, there is a enormous survey taking population in the U.S. of people who have signed up to take online surveys. I don't know what the situation is in Europe. But basically what these companies do is they maintain a panel of respondents who have signed up voluntarily to take online surveys. And most of the surveys they're going to get are for consumer experiences. They might get a survey that's like, are you thinking about buying a car in 6 months? What kind of car are you looking for? And then Ford and Toyota and whatnot are the ones designing these surveys to try to figure out what their strategy should be to convince people to buy their cars. But of course, these people can answer any questions, right? And so you can ask them. Here's the key in my mind. When I was doing research on this in graduate, I was shocked. You can pay people $3 to $4 for a 20-minute survey, right? If you do that per hour, that's about $12 an hour. That's greater than the minimum wage actually in the US. But it turns out people don't usually sign up for these surveys for the money. It's not that. Most of these people just like being asked questions. They like being surveyed. I don't understand that. I like archive every survey, even though I want to be that good participant, but I get that email, like take the survey, and I'm always like, I don't have time for that. But that's not true for a lot of people. A lot of people, they do care about answering these surveys, and it's not just about the money. There are also more expensive B2B options if you can figure that out. The way these typically work is you actually agree on a final set of completes. You'll agree on, let's say, 10,000 respondents, and then you'll keep sampling until you get 10,000 complete surveys. So you never pay for people that you don't actually use. This actually makes it difficult to calculate response rates because for the people who get kicked out of your survey, you don't know if they're actually in your population of interest. So there are some challenges that it creates. If you look at the distribution of people who sign up on these platforms, they tend to be women and they tend to be part-time work. But here's the key. You can drop whoever isn't in your population of interest. So if you want to focus on full-time workers, if you want to focus on tech workers, if you want to focus on, whatever it is, you get to decide that. And so, what you have to make sure that people are telling the truth, but, you can overcome the kind of natural skew of the folks who do sign up for these surveys. You can also use quotas to make sure that your samples are representative of who you're trying to target. And just one caveat here, if you are trying to contact a hard to reach group like executives or doctors, it's going to be much more expensive to do that. The cheapest options are when it's not too hard to find these people. Okay, so here's some pitfalls in survey development. This is the hardest one in my mind, defining your questions and scope creep. Because as soon as you start writing your survey, you're going to immediately think of 1,000 more research questions that you could add. And you always think to yourself, oh, if I just add one more question to this survey, just think about the possibilities. It's a new moderator, it's a new variable, and you move forward. And if you keep going that way, you're just going to have an enormous survey that is not tight. And so it's so easy to do though, you guys. It's so easy because you just think like, there's another paper here if I just add one question. Okay, so in my mind, the hardest part of this is once you've defined your questions that you're trying to answer, your main questions, I should say, because there are, of course, ancillary questions that come up later that you didn't even think about. But once you've got your main questions and you're trying to keep scope creep down, in my view, the hardest part of survey development is backward induction and really theory building. And what I mean by that is you need to think at the end of the day, what is the data going to look like and what are you going to be able to do with it? And so You have to make sure that your survey is going to get answers to the questions that are going to shed light on the competing theories that you're thinking of, the assumptions that underlie them, different predictions of different theories, heterogeneity. It's like, you know, imagine you spent all this money and you know you get the survey back at the end of the day and you're like, oh my gosh, if I would have just asked that one question, then I could have really distilled these theories. Then like you're stuck, right? So this is where you just like question yourself. You're like, should I push go? Have I thought through this hard enough? And the reason it's challenging is because you effectively have to think about all of the ways that your paper or papers, which theories could be right. So you have to actually think about writing like, 4 or 5 versions of the same paper and collect all of that data to get to the bottom of it. It's a really, really intensive exercise to create a survey. And ideally, of course, however the data, the paper comes out, the data comes out, you would want to be able to publish it. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you're going to pursue a survey, it's a little risky to pursue a survey where it's like, well, if the answer goes like this direction, then it's publishable. If it goes the other direction, then it's not. And so what I want to say here is, I think surveys are best used when either way, it's going to be a big contribution. Importantly, also in survey development, if you don't bundle in questions that can help replicate what we already know, people can discount your work. And the reason is because they're like, oh, all of this is new and great, but like, does it actually replicate what we know previously, right? And if you can't show that, then people are going to discount the quality of what you're showing them. And so it's really important to be able to replicate prior work here. And if you can link with public available data, as Karen said, like ask people for their LinkedIn profile, for example, and then you can follow them later. You can do other stuff, so link to public available data as well. Okay. So what about data cleaning? Of course, responses to survey questions can be total gibberish, as I'm sure all of us know. And so you want to build in checks to catch non-compliant responses. You've also got issues of unit non-response. That's when nobody, you send an email to somebody, they don't respond at all. That's unit non-response. And then you've got item non-response, which is when people don't answer a certain question. Okay, so there are imputation techniques. Sometimes that's actually an outcome you care about, is that they didn't respond. So like in our survey with Ben, we asked people, do you have a business idea? And if you're thinking about sort of the Anson and Yao appropriability story of how people start businesses, they may not want to share their idea. Like that's the whole point. And so like that's actually an outcome for us that we're interested in. And of course, double checking skip logics and all this sort of stuff. Okay. One important thing also when you're cleaning your data is like you need to think about the representation and whether you've actually matched your population of interest. It's possible you didn't, and you consider weighting your data. Okay. So let me talk about some of the pitfalls I've experienced personally. Okay, and how it relates to survey development when it comes to publishing these papers. As Karen mentioned, descriptive work is harder to publish. It's harder to publish in general, and so it's important to think about identification in all of your work. And so I think you have to if you can't nail identification, you got to write survey questions that are going to shed light on the most reasonable alternative explanations for your results. You want to build in questions that you can use as instruments. So Karen, I don't know if you guys did this where you like thought you should put this question as an instrument or if it just worked out that way. But I think it's better to be strategic on the front end, right? What's your theory about why some Z variable should influence some X variable and not affect Y through any other path, right? Like you can build that into your survey and then you have an instrument built in, or several instruments potentially if you want to gain power. Or you could run information experiments where you randomize things that you share with people in the survey. Ultimately, the whole point of the survey is going to be to get some rich data that you can't get other ways. And if your paper does not showcase the richness of that data, then you are doing yourself a disservice, and the paper is going to have a hard time. Okay, so okay. Oh, that's it. That's all I got. Okay, so that's all I have, you guys. Thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate all my co-panelists here.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was fantastic. We're going to now turn the time over to Christina. Christina, brace yourself. And I just want to say, keep up the good work here. If you do have any questions, feel free to message me. If we have time at the end for Q&A, I'm kind of storing the questions and we'll come back to them.
All right. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me? All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. I know it's quite early for a few and maybe not so much because we're all over the place, but regardless, appreciate your coming and look forward to your questions, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this cool panel. I'm learning from the others, and I have a few points that are going to maybe reiterate or build on some things. I'll try not to be repetitive. So I come at this from a bit of an idiosyncratic approach because I partnered with a large government agency, the US Census Bureau, to do the survey work that I did. And quite frankly, when I first started this, I had no idea what I was doing. And so perhaps it appeals to those of you who came because you have no idea what you're doing and you want to explore this. So maybe I can speak to you. And then there's a few things that are interesting in the contrast. So let me get into this. I subtitled this Confessions of an Administrative Data Addict, because as I'm going to share, some of what I do is actually very hard and very costly, and I can't stop doing it because the data ends up being so good. So you're going to want to think about my approach as, just very high cost, but also high reward. Okay, so to get into this, I have to put a little disclaimer up because I am everything that we've collected actually falls under a whole bunch of federal statutes that protect the privacy of the respondents. And so I can't even go into a data center and run a regression and tell anybody about it. I have to go through some very careful vetting, and everything I'm going to show you today has been vetted. I'm also going to step back a little bit and motivate why I got into this. You heard some great stories about, you might want to do survey data because you can get at things that you can't. And I'm going to give you a specific example of things that you might want to get at. And so for me, I've always been motivated by technology. I went and got my doctorate to study technology. Before that, I'd been in startups in Silicon Valley, and I was like, I really want to understand this. And then I realized that part of the reason we didn't have, and still don't have, some of the systematic understanding of technology adoption and its implications is this stuff is really hard to measure. Really, really hard to measure. And in fact, it's so hard to measure that Gartner has like a whole thing about this called the hype cycle. And so one of the, some of the fun facts about emerging technologies is captured in this fun little thing where at the very beginning of these new technologies, we don't even know what to call them. So if you're thinking about how do I survey and measure this, you have the first order problem is people don't agree on what the words are. So one of the things I study is cloud computing, and it's really funny at the early days to listen to what people were saying about the terms cloud computing. Now we all take it for granted, but I was still around when we were talking about cognitive computing. And this, according to Gartner, has already become obsolete before it even plateaued. So now we call it AI, but cognitive technologies and cognitive computing, those were the terms of the day. And this ambiguity and difficulty doesn't stop anybody from kind of getting over their ski tips with excitement and investment and wanting to study it. We get the peak of inflated expectations. So this always takes off before there's really a there. And this is really irritating to a lot of people, me included. I work on AI. I have a new survey that's going to be coming out with the MOPS team that surveys about AI. But everyone's talking about a thing that, according to the annual business survey, and I'm going to show you a bit about that, has an adoption rate like in the single digits. And so there's this disconnect between the reality and the excitement and what's really going on in the economy. And this is not just like a research problem. This is actually harmful for firms who are putting all this money in, and then they end up in the trough of disillusionment, which is a very nice way of describing this. But it doesn't mean that we as researchers or even as firms slow down, but it does mean that we have got to grapple with what I call the measurement paradox. That if you don't catch the before, or at least the early days, it's very difficult to measure the change. And so to echo some of what Evan said, you want to know what you're going to do with your data at the end of the day. And if you're going to try to talk about the impact of something, you're going to want to be able to measure how it moved. So figuring out the difference in the before and the during and how big of a move that is something you actually have to bake into your research design. And academics actually have a role to play in climbing this slope up to the plateau of productivity. We have a lot of useful insights actually for the firms and the managers that want to do this. So this is what keeps me going. You're going to get complaints no matter what you do. You're going to get reviewers who don't like what you do. So you are going to have to just stand, have the courage of your convictions and be very clear in explaining what you do and what your contribution is. And I discuss this a bit more in a working paper that's available online. I have all this stuff linked on a website that I will share with you. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that not only do you want to know your research question and have hypotheses, you're going to want to understand why they matter. So things that are very well specified are not always the biggest contributions, and there's often a tension here. And so you want to go in knowing what the gap in the literature is. You're going to want to know why this is important because it's going to be costly. And so what's always motivated me here is what's kind of called the IT productivity paradox. Here's some recent sites on this, that we have lots of investment, but often low returns. We see all this expenditure in the aggregate, but maybe not in the productivity data. Increasingly, economists are very concerned about rising concentration, superstar firms. There's a lot of conversation about whether this is linked to IT, but we don't actually have a lot of evidence. And then for a management audience, how do we manage firms in this digital age? If everything is moving so fast, then we really have to grapple with some key questions like, if this is so great, why isn't everyone doing it? How do we understand diffusion? The RBV concerns that Evan pointed to, if these things are widely available, how can firms achieve and sustain some sort of differentiation or superior performance? And then the other thing is that one of the reasons you need surveys is not only because you can answer questions that are hard to get at, but because some questions need microdata. And there's a lot of hype and interest around, say, AI and robotics, and people have been going after this with aggregate data, and it really misses important questions around competition and firm reallocation. Lin Wu and co-authors Dixon et al. Have a great paper on robots where they go into the microdata and find stuff that you're not seeing in the aggregate. So I recommend that. And then for me, I'm very much focused on these contingencies and complementarities that Karen also pointed to, that these things are arriving unevenly and the heterogeneity matters. And we've seen this with general purpose IT. I've done some work with the data and data-centered management practices with Eric Brynjolfsson. There's this increasing interest in intangibles. Everyone talks about intangibles. And one of the things I'm gonna point out here and reiterate both what Karen and Evan said is that sometimes what's intangible to one researcher is actually just a hard to measurable. And maybe we can actually get at that if we go after it directly. So that's what we do, is we go in and we try to do some really frontier measurement of both the tech and these intangibles, these workplace complements. We try to get at causality. We built in an instrument. So I won't be the first or the last person to say that today. And then to pay attention more to humans, to process design, and to think about the future of work, because that's getting a ton of attention. Okay, so one of the concerns raised today is, can you get to the right person and can you get them to respond? And I got to sidestep all of that because this goes out with the annual survey of manufacturers, and then it goes to the person in the firm whose job it is often to do these things, and their response is required by law. So that's kind of cool. That's part of why I keep signing up for this pain. And it's not obvious how you would want to copy what I did. So one of the things I reflected on when I got this invitation was, someone wants to do what I did. How do you do that? And so from my perspective, I think the right model is to think of what I did as being an idea entrepreneur. And it's a good model for researchers quite generally, but in particular, we know that entrepreneurs have to leverage their networks, they have to leverage their domain expertise, they've got to be ready to iterate rapidly, they've got to market test, they've got to keep the customer in mind, they have to make strategic commitments, and they're going to have to be lucky and persistent. And that's really the best way to describe what I did. And I can tell war stories offline. I think it might take too much time if I get into too much of the background. But, you know, I leverage my network. So I had started using this data as a consumer when I was a graduate student, and I was connected to the Census Bureau, and I went to DC, and I went to these conferences, and I got to know the people who were doing this. So I was around when the opportunity came up. And then I knew my brief cold, and this is so important. You have to know your literature and your contribution so early, because you have to motivate the content and the approach. I have to motivate everything I do, you know, every question we add to census. I have to fight with my collaborators on the MOPS for space on the survey. So we're always horse trading and motivating, you know, why this question and not the other question. We've had to go after a ton of money. So we have to motivate this for funders, and we have to motivate for government gatekeepers. So we don't get to just do this. We have to go through the Office of Management and Budget, because they don't want everybody, every agency in the government just sending surveys to firms, because the response is required by law. They have to, you know, tamp down on that. We iterated a ton. We did a bunch of cognitive testing, which I'm going to speak to, because there's actually a difference between cognitive testing and piloting. And I want to emphasize the former here. And then just to reiterate what Evan and Karen said about, you know, how we're going to use this measure in our research. Sometimes there's a tension between an obvious way to ask a question and how you actually put it in a regression and actually interpret it and make sense of what you're seeing. I'm going to talk a little bit about burden, cognitive burden. There's always a trade-off. Evan touched on this with scope creep. Like, you really can't just throw everything you want on your survey. And so you really have to commit to these trade-offs, and you really have to be persistent. Why do I do this? So as in most things that we do, there's a trade-off. There's a pain and there's a gain. And I'm gonna go over the gain first before you think I'm crazy, because otherwise you would wonder why anyone would sign up for the frictions, which I will also share. So the gain is that we get these truly representative samples because they're stratified. They are, you know, the responses required by law, Census Bureau employees follow up. They really get a representative sample. You know, just because it's hard to measure your population of interest, you don't get to overinterpret findings in selected samples without a lot of work. So a lot of people say, well, I just have to go to war with the data I have. And it's not true. Just because it's tough doesn't mean you get to interpret whatever you want. And you really do have to think about selection in any data set. The other thing that's been really key here for me is a bunch of my work looks at cloud computing and what happens with the survival and productivity of young and small firms. And boy, are those hard to reach. Those are hard to reach. They're hard to see. They're hard to track. And they're systematically missing from a lot of data sets. You know, CompuStat is not going to help here. And so being able to stratify by size in the census data has been really meaningful to my work. We get to see the private firms, so it's not just what's publicly available. We get all the industry stratification. As I mentioned, we get high response rates because if you don't respond, you can face a fine. People follow up from the Census Bureau. They validate the data for us. So I'm actually not managing all the mailback surveys. And we have dedicated responders in the firms who keep files on how to answer these types of surveys. And so it's actually pretty good quality data as well. And there's extensive cross-validation for all of this, all these data sets across years and with other data sets where possible. Again, the census staff help with this. We get these massive samples. So the annual business survey that I had the privilege of contributing to had 850,000 firms across the US. And that sort of number is really kind of no joke. And so if you want to check that out, you can see the working paper with Zolas et al. It's an NBR working paper now. And then what I want to spend a little bit of the rest of my time kind of getting back to is we had a lot of experts help us with survey design and cognitive testing. And this is where the secret sauce, I think, really goes in, because doing the cognitive testing and making sure your respondents can really do what you're asking them to do is very, very essential. So the other benefit here is that we can link to the administrative data. And again, that's no joke. So it's, you know, the IRS balance sheet data with revenues, COGS, inventory, wage bill. I'm going to put a bunch of my papers up here in teal. And you can view this either as shameless self-promotion or helpful examples, depending on your preferences. I'm going up for tenure soon, so my preferences are irrelevant. So I hope you will interpret this in the best possible way. So this is an example of how, you know, we've used the census data. We can look at accumulated investment and capital expenditure. That's what you need to really get a total factor productivity and to really look at the stocks of things that firms can use in their production function. So Eric and I did this in our 2019 working paper that's under review right now. We get all these time varying inputs. So you can do some cool econometric stuff with, say, like Ackerberg, Caves, Fraser, some of these new techniques for production function estimation. We get to see employment, growth, and survival. So we've used all that because we can get these different performance measures for these firms. You can link to patent data. I've poked at that, but I haven't done that yet. I've looked at e-commerce, so you can look at the different modalities through which the firms are selling things. We can look at establishments within the same firm, so we can get a view of the organizational design, the firm boundaries. And so I've done some work with Chris Foreman on that. We can do employer-employee linked data analyses, which Evan also touched on. So we have a paper where we can look at the earnings implications of IT adoption. So this new working paper with Barth et al., we see age bias in IT adoption, and that really helps us think about the future of work. So there's all this rich data that we can link to. Other types of IT investment, so we can get rid of confounds. We get this in long panels. We can get this for the entire market in some years. We can see within the firm, we can see within the market, though sometimes identifying competitors is still a bit tricky. But the benefits of all this data is very hard to overstate for identifying the effects you care about. Okay, there's a pain, and it's not trivial. So sometimes when you are sending something to respondents whose response is required by law, is you can't make it too tough. In other types of contexts, what happens is they just opt out, but they can't in our setting. So we have to be super careful that, you know, what we're asking makes sense, and it has to make sense to a lot of different respondents. So sometimes we can lose some detail and specificity. So sometimes we get some general questions. And boy, does this take time. So I know I've seen in the chat some junior researchers wondering, you know, can I do this? This is not something to embark on if you don't have a reasonable lead time. And it's very expensive. And I'm not even sure I'm allowed to say how expensive, but it's more than the numbers in millions, let's put it that way. And we had to get a bunch of different organizations on board, but they've been very supportive. So many thanks to Sloan and Kaufman and Russell Sage and the National Science Foundation. And, you know, grant writing is a whole other capability. So if you want to do this, you're going to have to put that tool in your toolkit. We have to get through cognitive burden on OMB approval, as I said, and we've done this in the past with mail. So that has put some path dependence on what we're doing. So we can't even just start from scratch. It's useful to understand when we're thinking about burden that there's a difference between actual and perceived burden of respondents. And I think both Karen and Evan touched on this, but this can really affect the quality of the data. If the respondents find this burdensome, they might still respond, but they might give you garbage. And if they, you know, just don't like a question, you might get this item non-response as well. So you have to really look at this from the point of view, the cost benefit analysis of the respondents. And an interesting thing to think about is that sometimes engaging or important topics can be longer. And I know Danny's going to speak to that a little bit when her turn comes, so I'm not going to get into that. But it's really important for your respondents to know, care, and trust how the data is going to be used. So sometimes survey communication can matter as much as the survey instrument. So how you communicate with your respondents can be very important. I didn't know if anyone else was going to touch on that today. For cognitive testing, don't outsource it. It's too valuable for iterating on your questions and interpreting your data ex post. So go to the cognitive testing sessions if you're getting help with your survey, and definitely do a bunch of this yourself. And there's an art and a science to this, and it's really important to have open-ended questions. And I thought you guys might enjoy a couple of examples. So asking the respondent to look at your survey and say, what does this mean to you? Because you'd be surprised how people interpret things, even when you define them. Sometimes they don't even read the definitions. Ask them to describe how they would answer the question, how long it might take them, and are you missing something? So sometimes you learn that that the theory, the known unknowns actually don't capture the world that you need to access, but the people who live in that world will tell you if you give them the opportunity. We always ask, is there something that is missing that we should be asking? It's useful to time it while you're doing it and understand that reading instructions can be costly. So you want to think about, how much do you want to guide respondents versus the burden cost of that? And sometimes a little bit of thinking is good. So you don't actually want it all to be quick and easy. You want just a little bit of disfluency so that they'll engage. And people can be really bummed out if you switch away from an important topic too fast. So you need to do some judgment, and you need to note if you can see people getting frustrated or tired, or if they're kind of excited. That's useful information as well. All right. So some other pain involved. I'm at the end of my time, so I'm gonna zip a bit quickly, and maybe we can come back to discussion. But data access after collection is really bad here. You have to go to the RDCs. You have to get cleared by the US Census Bureau. This can take a long time. You have to go through disclosure avoidance. And unlike what Evan said, you don't get to own your data forever. You get a little bit of a lead time before it's publicly available to anybody with an approved project. So there's no moat around this activity. Some cool things to learn that I learned that I just want to highlight, and again, I'm happy to discuss more. It's so tempting not just to do scope creep, as Karen and Evan mentioned, but to combine too many things in one question. So it's really critical to do one construct per question. Otherwise, you're actually asking an interaction term. And I have some examples of how we blew that. Either us or someone else at Census blew that in prior surveys. There's the question of panel, and sometimes you can get at panel stuff through recall. And I know Mike is going to talk about that. So I'm not going to go into that too much, except that you might need somebody to also have been at the firm for the period you want recall over. So you should also collect tenure information when you do that. Measurement error is a really big deal. And if you can actually pin that down, it will help you interpret your findings. So we had the, to us, good fortune, and to Census Bureau, horrible embarrassment of having sent the survey to the same firm, 2 different people. And we were able to actually see the measurement error in those responses, and it can be very, very high. So Bloom et al. On the MOPS measured this at almost half of the variation that we were observing. And some measures cannot be captured with this approach. So if, for instance, you are interested in employee engagement, you can't ask the manager. You need to actually go to the employees. And there's ways of doing that. And I'm happy to share some of the surveys I know that can do this. And then for us, getting these workplace compliments and these unobservables, very, very important. And so, just to show you that this is the productivity of predictive analytics, depending on the workplace compliments. As you can see, all of the value shows up in the workplaces with the compliments and nowhere else. And if we hadn't captured that information, we would have gotten the story completely wrong. Just an example, they talked about rolling your own instruments. we anticipated this and asked whether the government was telling the workplaces whether to collect the data. And that turned out to be a very helpful instrument for us. And then we also asked some questions about some strategic commitments and design of the production process. And that's turned out to be very helpful in the research as well. Okay, some key takeaways. The data doesn't fall from the sky. And you need to understand the data generating process and all these things that Evan and Karen talked about, and the people who are going to come after me will talk about. I think we also have to grapple with the fact that we don't get to ignore this when we don't run surveys. That this data generating process matters for all data. Data never speak for themselves, and we always have to be aware of this. But sometimes we can design away these key pitfalls. I'm going to put this up here. I learned a lot about running firm surveys from this book, and all the papers that were in teal are available on my website. So I encourage you to go there if you want to find anything that I zipped by too quickly. So thanks again for your attention and for including me on this really great program.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was well done. We'll now turn the time over to Daniela. And after her, Mike will wrap things up, and then we'll get going to, if we have time for Q&A, and if not, I'll give further instructions for the breakout. Okay, thank you. Take it away, Daniela.
All right, I already see thumbs up. Awesome. Okay, let me just move this chat out of the way. So thank you guys for inviting me to be part of this. This is great, and I love talking about surveys. So, you know, if I must be up at this early on a Sunday morning, this is actually a good thing to be doing. All right, so has already been a lot of really helpful, useful information, advice, and on survey methods and different types of surveys. My value added here is going to be telling you about my experience with the World Management Survey, which is the project that's taken over my life for the past 15 years. But the project itself has gone on for 18 years. And so we've learned a lot, and a lot of things have gone wrong, and we've found ways of fixing it. So I can go over a lot of that stuff. And a few of the points you'll note have already come up at least twice or 3 times. So I hope you don't see those as necessarily repetition, but just a highlighting of what's actually really important, and it keeps coming up. Everybody who does surveys, these things come up. So I'm going to start off with just telling you a little bit about the World Management Survey in case you haven't heard of it, and what the key points of that methodology is, and then I'll spend most of my time on the lessons, and then just one slide on thinking about publishing the results. Okay, so let me start with the WMS. So the World Management Survey is a phone survey. So unlike Christina's awesome response rate census you have to do this by law, we spent a lot of our time trying to convince managers to take this survey. We have been quite successful at this though. So the WMS has to date over 13,000 firms across 39 countries. These are the countries highlighted here. And it's over, I think, 15,000 observations at this point as well, because we do have some panel data. And it started out as manufacturing, right? So the original survey was 18 questions in manufacturing, and across just 4 countries, and then now it's grown. But the methodology itself lends itself well to other sectors as well. And so since then, we have expanded it to retail, schools, and hospitals. And then other people who are experts in bureaucracies and police stations and universities expanded the survey to then also tackle the same type of managerial practices that we're measuring in the survey in these other sectors, which has been really cool. Now, over the past 5 years, we have also shared the data, making it publicly available, anonymized, of course, suitably anonymized, to over 5,000 people who have downloaded it from the website. And we do share the identified data. So if there's a good research project with a credible question that you'd like to look at, you can apply for the identified data where you have firm identifiers to match into other data sets and use that in your project. Now, we're not in the business of telling you if your question is good or not. That's completely up to you. All that we need to check is that our IRB things, which I'm going to talk about, are checked off. So is this, a credible research project rather than somebody from industry just trying to get some data on firms. So just to highlight, you can go to worldmanagementsurvey.org if you're interested in using this data. So there are 4 key parts of the WMS methodology that I want to go over in terms of both the method, the survey method, but also the operationalization of the method. And they'll be linked to some of the pitfalls that I'll discuss later. So I'll just want to quickly go over this first. So the first thing is question development. And again, this is something you've heard already a lot about, and how to think about your questions. Now, the WMS ended up, or the manufacturing WMS ended up with 18 questions that go over basic operations and then monitoring the production process, target setting, and then incentives and people management. And it didn't start with 18 questions. You know, the very first pilot in 2002, 2004 actually had more questions, but then they were dwindled down to 18. The way that happened is because there's the decision of the type of question is that it was going to be on a scoring guideline of 1 to 5. And I'll talk about the scoring in the next slide. And in short, it goes from little to no structured practices to at least some formal practice in place that is a 3, and then best practice that's 5. And then the questions that couldn't be put on that framework, and some can't, like strategy, or, you know, there's questions that just can't be put on that kind of scale. And so those questions were not used in favor of questions that we could actually put on a set scale like that. So, and I think that's come up a couple of times of, you know, how do you think about the types of questions that you're going to use, and how can you then put them together after. So the second thing that's really important about the methodology is who to interview. Now, Christina's already talked about this as well. So in our case, the WMS is a medium, small, medium firm, so but not in the small as tiny firms. It's more at least 50 employees, so 50 to 5,000. So you need, you know, sizable firms. And then you have to identify who the manager who's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the plant is. Otherwise, they can't answer this survey properly, right? So in our case, it's a plant manager, whoever's the senior most manager at the establishment. It could also be operations manager or someone like that, but you certainly don't want the CEO if it's a very, very large firm, because the CEO doesn't know what's happening at the day-to-day, right, at the floor, the shop floor level. So that was important. The other thing is, we also confirmed the manager's been in the post for at least 1 year. The reason for this, it goes back to question development. So a part of the questions are about the annual reviews of and performance reviews of employees. Those tend to happen annually, right? So if the manager hasn't been there for a year, you've just spent 40 minutes talking to them, and then you get to the people management questions and they can't answer a single one because they haven't done it. Right? So that's the kind of thing you definitely want to sort of check ahead of time. What are the restrictions of your respondents, and who do you really need to get to? Then there's, for us, the really hard part of getting managers to participate. So this is about an hour's interview. So we had to make this chat is really interesting. So you have to train the analysts or the interviewers here to actually keep an engagement. So it's not on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think blah, 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 you know, because that gets tiring, as Christina talked about cognitive burden, you know, that gets tiring and boring. And so the manager doesn't, and it goes to my next point here, that the manager doesn't really know they are being scored in this particular survey. And so it's very much a conversation structured. And so the manager, the analysts are trained to extract information across a chat. We also have endorsement letters from reputable institutions, which helped, you know, with the credibility. And then finally, the last point of the methodology that I want to highlight is that we go through great lengths to try and get unbiased and comparable responses across countries. And to do that, we have centralized training. So it's the same set of people who have been training analysts for the past 18 years, which in itself is not that easy to do. But, you know, we've tried to, we have lots of manuals on how to train so that the training is very consistent. The questions are open-ended but structured. And as I said, it's double blind. So the manager doesn't know they're being scored. There's not a clear right answer, so to speak. And then we also do a bunch of calibration exercises, which I'm happy to discuss all of these details later. But I just want to quickly go over to, so what is the scoring guide here? Something that you might want to use in a survey of your own. The idea behind a WMS is that it gets what's actually happening at the firm rather than feelings about how the manager feels or thinks. And if you want to know how the manager feels or thinks or perceptions, then this isn't the survey, right? The survey here is really trying to sort of cut through that. And across the 18 topics, the way that this works is one, as I said, no structured practices in place. A two is when there's some informal practices in place, but a lot of it is a reactive approach to how to management practices. A three is a formal process is implemented, but there's some weaknesses. A four is when there's a good formal process in place, but perhaps there's not it's not used often enough. And then five is sort of best practice. And again, every question sort of fits into that. Here's one example. This is for the monitoring management part of the survey. So this is the grid for the performance tracking part. The analyst here would start off with, so how do you track the performance of your firm? So very specifically, the question isn't, do you track the key performance indicator X, Y, or Z? Because there's obviously, if you're a plant manager, yes, you should be tracking something, right? So that seems like there's a right answer there. So the question is, how do you do it? How often do you track your indicators? Can you tell me a bit more about them? If I was to walk around your plant, could I tell how well you're doing against your KPIs? And then one is everything is sort of ad hoc. A three is there's some set of indicators, and then a five is everything is sort of continuously tracked and communicated. Think like Toyota at this point. Okay, so that's just a short summary of the WMS. Again, I'm happy to talk to anybody about that in more detail, but I want to get to what all the things that have gone wrong in the past. So first of all, in terms of developing questions, I think one of the more important parts of this has been understanding what you're measuring and the idea that questions are very costly. And again, this has come up a couple of times. Every question in your survey should get you something that's directly tied to your research question or what you're trying to get at. And then secondly, is there something that you can only measure using your method? And so again, this has also come up. And survey mode, whether you do it on a self-responded survey or whether you do it on the phone, there's going to be things that you can only get from a particular method, right? So some things you can't measure using self-respondent, and some things you shouldn't measure using the phone because you don't need to, right? And because you can get it easier in a self-respondent type survey. One point I do want to highlight in terms of across countries is that back translations are very useful. And so when you come up with your question, if you're going to do this across countries, it's not enough to just translate the question. You also want to get somebody from that country to back translate it into English and then compare those and see if those are actually the same. We do this in English even, right? So when we were doing this, in Australia or in Canada, and the people who came up with this were British. And there's this amazing one page in The Economist I saw a long time ago that actually had a whole page of things that the British say, and then how did the Americans interpret it, how the Canadians interpret it, how the Brits interpret it, and it's very, very different. So even in English, you want to do back translation. So it's but that's a very useful way to kind of develop your survey in a way that across countries means the same thing. And then it goes back to Christina's, what does X mean to you? So that's very important. The other thing is paying attention to question orders. And again, I think Christina's already talked about this too. Every question gets your respondent into a mind frame. And so asking a question early or later matters. And sometimes that might even be your research question, right? And it goes to the potential of experiments. So when you ask a question in the beginning, you give some information, you ask the question later, see if that's changed. Also, you want to be clear and precise. It goes back to how easy it is to then compare across countries. But also, nobody likes to be confused. If your question is convoluted, you might lose people just from, you have to read a whole chunk of question before you answer it. This is complicated. I don't want to read it twice. These people don't know what they're doing. So clear, precise, nothing too complicated. Okay, so that's developing questions. The second point is navigating IRB. So always start with understanding your IRB rules. You'll need IRB, and it's especially now with the data protection laws in Europe, and it's just getting harder and harder. So always start with what those rules are. How long does it take? It is not a quick process. Even if you have a fantastic IRB department, it can take 2 months before they give you authorization to start your survey. So understand how long that takes. How much paperwork is there? Can you do it alone? Do you need help? And what is non-negotiable from your standpoint? Because the first thing that IRB is going to do is they're risk averse, right? So they're very conservative in terms of the types of questions you can ask and things like that. So, and data protection and all that. So you want to make sure that you know which questions can you change, which parts of your process can you change, and which ones you can't, right? So in our case, we cannot tell the managers they're being scored. That is non-negotiable because it affects the kind of answers we get. So that was always, it's always a point of contention. And so we have a 2-paragraph already, a block that we put on every single one of our IRB approvals. And the other question is, can you submit amendments? So in the past, it was a lot easier to do so. It's getting a lot harder. So if you can't submit amendments, let's say you discovered you forgot a question, or as you're doing your interviews, you're like, oh my God, I need to do this. Amendments, if you can submit amendments, that's a bit less risky. But if you can't and you have to do it all over again, that's a lot of time. And then how long is it valid for? If you get it for your pilot, can you use it for your actual survey? And then you pilot, okay? So why do you need to pilot? You got to plan for stuff that's going to go wrong, and it's always better when it goes wrong small than in a you're halfway through this massive wave and you say, oh my God, this is not working. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about piloting. So what are you piloting? What are you doing? It's different from the cognitive testing that Christina was talking about. So the first point here is cognitive testing. That's one of the points of question of your question content you're going to pilot, but it's not necessarily the whole pilot. The other thing is variation. So when you come up with a question, you think, oh, this is going to be great. People are going to have different answers, but perhaps the way you ask the question isn't the right way to get you the variation that you need. And turns out everybody's answered the same way. And then you say, well, okay, if there's no variation, your question is effectively useless. So going back to, well, does this give you, are you measuring the right construct? Is this giving you the variation you want? Sensitivity, and especially again, across different languages, different cultures, different countries. Do people get upset about a particular question? You might have not thought it was sensitive, but turns out it is. And then you have people calling your IRB and telling you that this is a bad survey. And then the question type, again, can you get to the simplest type of question? The second thing is survey length. So how long does each question take? What is the cost benefit of each one of your questions? People get tired, data quality falls with the last few questions. So you also want to front load your most important ones. Unless there's framing, of course, and you need the question in order to be that way. The third thing is the operational structure. So you can't underestimate how complicated it can be to run a survey. So staff, can you do this alone? Are you going to do it yourself? Or are you going to hire a firm like Qualtrics or some of these other firms to help you? What kind of sampling frame do you want? Is it a cold random sample? Do you need that? Or can you buy sort of a willing sample that other people have talked about that, people sign up to do the surveys? What kind of incentives do you need to offer? If it's money, that makes your survey more expensive. Can you offer a report at the end? Possibly, but that is less likely than that people are actually going to want to do it. Software, what kind of software are you going to use? Survey CTO, Qualtrics, whatever it is, have that sorted. Takes a while sometimes to code it. And then the legitimacy. Do you need a website for people to trust you? Do you have a website? And this is a thing I think is really important even for PhD students. If a manager who's answering your survey or a person can't find you, they might not want to actually trust you, right? Then also on the respondents, you want to pilot, again, did you pick the right person in the organization? So maybe you thought you needed to talk to the CEO, but turns out they don't know how to answer your questions. Or maybe they do, but you don't need the CEO. You could do with somebody a little lower. And as Evan was saying, depending on who it is, it's easier or not to get those people. And then as any sort of minimum job requirements, you also need to put down. And then in terms of response rates, what is the minimum response rate you need? And I saw in the chat, there was already some talk about the sample size and so on. So I won't spend too much time here. But one thing I'll say is if you hire a firm, get it in contract, in writing, in your contract, what that response rate is meant to be and how many and what your N is meant to be. And then have a backup plan. What happens if it doesn't work? With a firm, that's not a problem. They'll sort it out. But for yourself, like what do you do if you can't get to your sample size? And so just very briefly talk about funding. Lots of opportunities to build up look for opportunities to build up the survey and pilot funds. There are a bunch of options. There's PhD startup grants. If you're an assistant professor, usually you can actually hit up your dean or your college, just say, do you have $5,000 that I can do a pilot with? Exploratory grants, Christina already talked about some of these. If you do work in developing countries, the IGC, the International Growth Center, and Federal and CPR have some grants as well. And it's useful to learn to write these. Pilots are useful for funding as well because you get something to show for it. And so I'll just say one thing about publishing, and then I'm out of time. So the first thing is using the baseline. So there's this great development impact blog that was published by David Evans a few years ago. When is the baseline more than a baseline? Google that. That's a fantastic 5 uses for your baseline survey. Why not? Just give it a try. You know, you have some baseline data. This has already come up. Get more than one paper out of your survey. You know, the WMS itself has several papers. One came from the management data, but then the decentralization questions, the HR questions, the ownership questions, all of those yielded papers on their own. So, you know, make sure that you can do that, because one survey, I mean, Evan's already talked about this. He's been extremely successful with one survey. So, and finally, know your audience, right? So what are your target journals? Think about it ahead of time so that you can think about what constructs you want to measure and so on, and how to get sort of the most bang for your buck. Okay, so I am out of time, so I will leave it at that, and looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and we'll now turn the time over to Mike.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let me get 1 second to share my slides. Okay, so can everybody see the slides okay? Looks good? Okay, great. Thank you. So I'd like to thank Ben and Evan for organizing this PDW, Mike, and for, yes.
So we can see your slides, but it's not full screen. I don't know if you're meant to have it full screen.
Oh, yes, I did, but let me go ahead and do it. So is that any better or no? Huh. Let me, hang on 1 second, sorry. Maybe. Oops. Is that better? Great. Okay, great. Okay, so start again. So first, I'd like to thank Ben and Evan for organizing this PDW and inviting me to participate. I'd also like to thank all the other speakers who've gone before me, because they've made this job much easier, in the sense that I agree with almost everything that they've said, especially about the things around survey design, some of the pitfalls. What I'm going to focus my comments on are really some of the issues, what I think are the most important issues when doing longitudinal surveys. And so everything that they've said so far about piloting, about, you know, the cognitive load for these, you know, thinking about, you know, the scope creep, putting in, you know, instrumental variables and all these kinds of things also apply to these types of surveys. Here, what we're going to talk about is when you are going through and surveying the same individuals, these same respondents, same firms, mostly individuals, kind of workers, over time. And so some of these problems can be amplified, magnified over time if you don't get things right the first time with the survey. So first, I'm just going to talk about what are some ways that you might be able to use longitudinal surveys in to try to answer research questions beyond thinking about some of these cross-sectional types of surveys. So some of the research designs, I think most of us, if we're familiar with some of these different types of surveys out there, are thinking about examining changes between individuals or observations over time. And so, you know, the closest type of survey that's out there that a lot of people use, that's close to what I've done, is some of the National Science Foundation science CSAT data. So there's surveys of doctorates and college graduates, but a lot of these data have been used to track employee mobility over time or transitions to entrepreneurship. You might also look at some changes that individuals experience over their course of employment, or firms experience over their practices. And you want to try to understand how these things are changing over time. A lot of these studies are really still trying to look at some of these, you know, a change in the aggregate across these individuals and some of these average changes. There's ways of trying to get at instrumenting for some of this endogeneity and some of these selection choices. But this is really kind of what I think most people really think of with longitudinal surveys, and we'll get to that. Another way of thinking about doing these surveys is if you specifically want to try to get at some of these issues of selection or treatment. And so here you might think of maybe 2 surveys or even multiple surveys where specifically the surveys are a bit different in that you're trying to get at something really unique. You're trying to get at some of these selection mechanisms. So why do people make these choices? for moving into certain types of firms or engaging in certain kinds of activities. You might also want to do these when you're trying to look at the influence of some kind of status change over time, when you know that people might make these kinds of changes in their life or in their employment status. You can also think about doing experiments. So Karen mentioned doing some experiments within the survey. But you can also think about how to do these surveys when there's a broader experiment. So you want to get some baseline type of survey of individuals before they move into some kind of treatment condition, and then looking at how they change over time after that. Another way, I haven't really seen this done with a lot of surveys yet, but this is a kind of increasingly popular method using administrative data, is if you want to have multiple or repeated observations of individuals over time to include fixed effects, both for individuals and for firms. So one approach is getting back to studies that were using census data by About, Krameritz, and Margolis, where you're including both individual fixed effects and firm fixed effects to try to tease apart workers from the firms. So there's been some studies that use this, looking at again, census data or patent data matched with CompuStat. I haven't seen this done with longitudinal surveys, but there have been some individuals who've done this with cross-sectional surveys. So Scott Stern, for example, in his 2004 paper on Do Scientists Pay to Be Scientists, did this where he was looking at individuals who had multiple job offers. And so he was able to get this individual fixed effect to try to tease out some of these unobserved characteristics, such as worker ability. So what I'm going to focus on is some of the experience I have, which is really trying to get at some of the questions, both in changes over time, as well as some of the selection or treatment. So just to put this into context, all my experience has been with working with the Science and Engineering PhD panel survey. That's been a long time collaboration with Henry Sauerman. So we were both graduate students together at Duke. We started talking about these issues. And what we shared was this interest in industrial scientists and how individuals who get training in with a PhD in academia make this choice between moving from academia into industry. And so that was kind of the broad question that we were interested in. But as we looked at a lot of these studies on industrial scientists, they're making these underlying assumptions that the industrial scientists share many of the same values and preferences and characteristics as academic scientists, that they want to publish, that they value that. And we were saying, that there's a lot of selection going on. Maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe there's reasons why they're leaving academia and they prefer to go into industry, but there really weren't any data available to allow us to examine that question. So the NSF data start tracking people after they graduate. So one of the common themes you've heard from all of us today is try to identify a really important question where there are no data that exist. And so you're trying to really develop some kind of unique survey, some unique data that's a big part of the contribution that allows you to answer a really important question that's hard to get at. And so obviously when you're thinking about these career choices, for us, the big problem was, what are some of the things that drive those? How do people make these choices? And so you have to observe these individuals, things about their characteristics, their preferences, the context that they're in before they make that choice. And so we also want to understand how these preferences form and change over time. So what we did in our study was we did a baseline survey of individuals who were PhD students. And so that's kind of the first novel step, I think, in what we did over like some of the NSF data, is that we wanted to actually see, especially for early stage PhDs, why are they doing a PhD? How are they thinking about their careers? But intentionally following them over time, knowing that at some point they will transition to staying in academia or leaving and going into industry or becoming an entrepreneur. And we wanted to be able to examine that overall process and how they make those choices. And so our subsequent surveys followed these respondents through various career stages. And I'll get to that because that was actually something that became very complicated for our study and ended up taking a lot more time to plan than we anticipated. But one thing we think about is because of the kinds of questions we were interested in, we asked this core set of common questions to examine changes over time. So comparing respondents in the first survey with how does this change once they transition to first full-time employment or maybe later throughout their careers. And so you want to understand how preferences or some kind of characteristic changes over time, but also we wanted to compare across different employment sectors or different groups of individuals. And then we also asked specific questions about these different kinds of transitions. And so we wanted to know specifically, for example, those who go into industrial R&D, we have studies planned where we're looking specifically at how that transition then impacts their subsequent productivity, for example, or choices around projects and their career advancement. And so it became a bit complicated to think about how to structure these surveys, especially over time. So just to illustrate this, you know, Evan talked about this the scope creep. And so when we did our first survey, you know, we actually had you know, a lot of questions in there. We had to think about which questions do we want to keep in. And as we learned some, we took some of these questions out. But when you think about it, the survey design should be tailored to the research question. And that's pretty obvious, but you really want to give a lot of thought to specifically what is the research question that you're asking? And more importantly, how are these individuals going to change over time? I think for us, we didn't think enough, I think, about specifically like, what are we exactly going to ask in these subsequent surveys? How are people going to change? And we had to learn how to adapt to that over time. But these changes typically require asking the exact same question in multiple ways. But this pre or post, if you want to try to get at some of the selection of treatment, may require these core questions that are asked over time, as well as very specific, unique questions. And so you have to give thought to what's the overall research design and how is that going to help you answer the question. You also have to think about when and how often to survey these respondents. And so you want to try to administer the survey at the same time of year or the same kind of stage of individuals to avoid some confounding factors. So just as an example, we did our survey in the spring. We want to try to get it well before people were, you know, transitioning to jobs. But every time that we did this survey, we always did it around the same time of year. And so you might also think about trying to do this with the, you know, certain stages of kind of career paths or firms. Surveying once per year is very common, but again, this depends on the change you're trying to study. Sometimes you might want to do a little more frequently, others you might want to wait longer. And sometimes these changes that you're trying to study occur between the surveys, and you need to consider how you're going to try to get at that. For example, are you going to ask questions about, you know, the conditions more recently at the time that this change occurred, or about their current conditions? So if you want to study, like we're looking at kind of an employment choice, you know, do you ask about their first job or the conditions that when they took their first job, or do you ask about their current conditions? And so we actually ask a little bit of both, but you want to think carefully about, you know, what kind of questions you're going to ask. And also, if you're going to ask some recall questions about what were things like at the time of the change, you want to keep them to things that are more factual and that are easier to recall, such as, you know, like we ask things about salaries and you know, kind of dates and things like that. But it'd be trickier to try to ask things about how they felt or why they made that decision, because ex post, people can rationalize certain decisions and their responses are likely to change. So attitudinal types of questions are much trickier, and you probably want to avoid those if they're recall, which is again why we wanted to survey these individuals earlier before those kinds of decisions that they make. And so you want to also anticipate how these respondents might change between the surveys. And so if you're comparing the same question over time, ensure that this response scale will be able to allow you to get at that kind of change that you want. And I'll talk about that a bit more in the next slide. And then if it's more this pre or post, consider how the respondent's job or status might change and when, and how you're going to try to capture some of that. So just to illustrate, this is one of the earlier kind of big challenges that we encountered is our baseline survey was the very first question was to ask them what their status is. And so I think this is also something that's important that I didn't hear others speak about, but sometimes for your sample that you have, it may include individuals that you really don't want to try to get at. So you can see here, we also asked if they were a master's student or working full time, because those are people we really didn't want in our survey. And so we kind of flagged those individuals and tucked them out of the subsequent rounds in the survey. But after that, for the next round in 2013 and 16, 29, we recognize that people are going to be at different stages. And so first of all, if they were still a PhD student or postdoc, we would give them essentially the exact same survey that they got before, and we're wanting to kind of see how they might change between times. If they were working full or part-time and they had transitioned to some kind of other employment, we would then ask, you know, these separate questions, and these would branch off into different career paths where there would be, again, these common questions across everybody, but also specific questions about that line of employment. And this is actually something that pushed back the submission of the next wave of our survey by about a year, because as we started thinking through all these possible career paths, it became very complicated. And we spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, what are the core sets of questions and that we want to keep across everybody, but also what are specific things. And we also mapped out, you know, specific studies that we'd want to do and how those might relate to that. So this is something where I think, planning in advance is really important on these types of issues. So thinking about sample selection and retention. So a lot of the issues that we've talked about already with sampling still apply here. I think what's a little bit unique here is that you have to anticipate attrition. You're not going to be able to get everybody in the subsequent surveys. And so I think you do want to oversample or try to go broader in the first survey, in the first wave, to ensure that you still have a sufficient sample size. So you're going to lose respondents, so just plan for that. And this can be especially important if your focus is some subgroup that comprises a small share of the overall sample. So if you want to look at founders, which in some of the more administrative data have been like 2 to 5% of kind of a population, you want to really ensure that you have enough individuals so that if you lose some people, you're not getting down to just a really small number of respondents. This can also apply if you want to start breaking the sample out. So for like us, if we're looking at industrial R&D employees, that then becomes some fraction of the overall sample we have. You also want to include questions in the first survey to address non-response bias. And so this has been some of the questions we've gotten from referees is about selection issues and people leaving the survey and what might drive that. Oftentimes it can be just demographic characteristics. So ideally you're not losing anyone systematically. And what you really want to be able to do is show that there isn't any kind of systematic bias in terms of who's not responding to subsequent surveys, but you want to plan that in advance beyond the normal types of questions you would include for sample selection bias. You also want to try to obtain some kind of stable contact information for these individuals. So they may change jobs, names, residences, and so depending on how you're identifying your sample, think about different ways of trying to get some kind of stable contact. So what we did was we initially contacted everyone through their university email that we obtained from department websites and the like, and we asked them for a personal email, like a Gmail or Yahoo account, to be able to contact them over time. And that's become obviously very important for our study. You also want to pay attention to what are some of the drivers of response rates and how can you try to ensure that you keep those up over time. And so I think one of the things we found is that we are asking, PhD students about careers, and that's something that's very important to them. And so we found that that's allowed us to really be able to get pretty good response rates and to keep people engaged over time. But you want to communicate in the email or the invitation why it's important for them to continue their participation in this study. And also you want to continue with the same respondents, I think, in each wave. So if someone doesn't respond to the second wave, you don't want to drop them out of the sample because there might be ways that you can work them back in depending on the research question. So I would just advise people to keep sending this out to the full baseline sample that you have in each subsequent wave if you're doing more than 2. At the same time, if you're surveying too frequently, this can really diminish response rates. So for example, if you're surveying every month or every 6 months, and it also can lead to some measurement error problems where people start to learn about the questions or they're more familiar and they change the way they're responding to this. Again, we surveyed every 3 years, and actually I did a lot of interviews with individuals after we surveyed them to kind of find out, how they were answering questions. And a lot of individuals actually didn't remember doing the survey. So I think if you're doing it kind of between years, you have some advantages there where that kind of a conditioning is less of a problem. But as Evan mentioned, a lot of surveys are going online now. And I think now the challenge, especially with doing subsequent surveys like this, is that we're getting too many email invitations to participate in online surveys. And so I think that's also something you want to kind of think about is how are you going to keep these individuals engaged and participating over multiple surveys. So there's also issues with measures and methods. So one key thing is you want to ensure that you don't change these core questions between surveys. Others have talked about kind of the ordering of the questions and how important that can be and the way you ask these questions. But even more important here is any small change just in the order of the responses or the changes of the wording or even the order of the question itself can lead to potential measurement error problems. So you want to try to keep that as the same as possible, but also think carefully about the impact on the validity of these responses if you add or remove other questions. And again, Henry and I spent a lot of time developing that second survey, thinking precisely about these issues and how the ordering and the framing might affect some of the responses. One other kind of little lesson learned in that is that as Evan mentioned, there's this scope creep. And so we included the first wave of our survey took almost 30 minutes to complete. So we wanted to really reduce the load on individuals in the second round. And there's different ways we approach that. But one of the things we did was we ended up removing some questions that at the time we did not think were very important, which now actually we realize are really pretty important. It would be great if we still had them. So think about those kinds of trade-offs over time and how you're going to keep questions but again, avoid changing any kind of core questions, but also think about how any kind of changes you make might impact those core questions as well. And consider how responses from different surveys will be analyzed. So this is also really quite different because you have to think about how you're going to use these measures and how you might construct different types of measures. So, and using these variables and regressions can be a bit trickier. So it's easier to report descriptive comparisons of, again, we look a lot of preferences, but what are the average preferences in time 1 and time 2? But when you get to regressions, you have to think about how you're going to use these different data together. And so one might be using responses from one survey to predict subsequent outcomes in a later survey, or you might actually have change scores. And so you want to understand specifically within individuals, if someone increases in a preference or decreases in a preference or attitude or some kind of behavior, how does that affect some kind of outcome of interest? And those types of measures are a little bit trickier to use and interpret in regressions. And you want to also be aware of some of the problems that arise from using the same data, the same method, that is the survey data for both on the independent variable and as a dependent variable. And what are some of the problems with that? And that leads to these common methods biases that can be problems. And this can be a big problem, especially for reviewers who are more familiar with using administrative data or other types of data and are a little more skeptical of surveys. So also one way of trying to overcome some of these problems is matching with external data. So Christina and Danny did a great job talking about kind of matching surveys with other data sources. Matching like your own survey with census ex post is probably going to be very challenging from what I hear from all my colleagues to use census data. But you might want to think about what are some other data sources that you can match to either fill in some of the gaps of things that might be missing, or to give you a little bit more precision on some of these changes over time. So it depends on the question you ask, but some might include, patents or publications or firm level data. In our studies, because we're interested in these workforce issues, these career profile data like LinkedIn have been really very valuable. And so these allow us to observe the actual employment outcomes using independent data. So even though our subsequent surveys still ask, what's their, what kind of job are they in, and specific details about, their salary and their work conditions, it's a little sensitive to ask people about their exact employer, and people don't always want to report that. And also you have to think about these trade-offs between, how much do you ask specific questions about when they started a job, for example. And so these types of data allow us to follow some of these over time. And also by having different data sources, you can avoid some of the concerns over common methods bias. This also allowed us to address some of this attrition and non-response by having this observable employment outcomes for nearly everybody in our sample, including those who didn't respond to subsequent surveys. And so one of the ways we've done this is we have our kind of baseline survey. We use that to predict the employment outcomes, and then we use the subsequent surveys for people who did respond when they were employed to dig into some other kinds of mechanisms and other types of issues there. And this provides really detailed data on job mobility between the surveys, including the dates and title, and things that are a little bit harder to get at from a survey, especially if you're doing a survey every couple of years. Some of the considerations when matching is you may need to include questions to obtain some of these unique identifying information. And this can be somewhat tricky, especially with IRB, because you might be getting really specific identifying information. Respondents may be reluctant to provide that kind of sensitive information. In our case, we got kind of lucky in the sense that our sample was based on identifying graduate students listed on department websites. So we already had their name, their university they were going to, and their degree, which allowed us to have a pretty high level of precision matching with LinkedIn. But you do want to think about what are some of the advantages of matching external data, what are some of the sources, and is there anything you need to include in your baseline survey to be able to do that better? So some of the high level takeaways, again, just kind of repeating some of these things, plan very carefully. This is true for all surveys, as all the speakers have mentioned, but it becomes even more important, I think, when you're doing multiple waves, because You're making a big investment in time and effort, and you want to ensure that you're thinking about how these respondents are going to change over time and how you're going to use those measures. Consider variables to include to account for sources of a measurement error or endogeneity, or maybe controls for important individual characteristics. I think that applies for cross-sectional surveys as well. But when you're looking at change over time, these become a bigger issue in doing good research and really trying to identify different kinds of effects. Oversample to account for attrition, consider other data that you might be able to match. And a number of people have talked about this, Evan's talked about this as well, but also these longitudinal surveys take time. So you want to try to plan other studies that you might be able to do while waiting. So Henry and I have been working on this for almost 15 years now, and I have about 11 publications so far from these data sets. And we also have papers that are R&Rs and in the pipeline. Just to give an example, our primary interest is really trying to understand how people are choosing between staying in academia or leaving industry. And to be quite honest, we haven't even started that paper yet, even though that's kind of the reason why we started this whole survey initiative. But we've looked at a lot of other important questions along the way, especially early on, trying to understand how do these preferences, what are some of the heterogeneity and differences in preferences across these different groups, and how they relate to some kind of expected outcomes, but also where did these preferences come from and how might they change over a period of time. And so for us, it was really looking at how career preferences change during graduate school and how that might relate to kind of career goals and career plans. But think about how you can try to get some work done with these surveys, and what are some kind of other important questions you can ask while waiting for individuals to change or to transition to some kind of other status over time. So Christina mentioned one book. Another book that we've used a lot that I think is really very helpful is this Dillman, Smythe, and Christian book on survey methods, especially for internet and phone. There's a chapter in there on longitudinal design, but it has a lot of really great techniques and methods of doing some of these larger surveys. And I really highly recommend this book. So thank you very much for your time. And if anyone's interested in some of these different articles and different ways we've used longitudinal data, you can get to this website. And I assume we're all going to share our slides in some way, so you'll have that link there. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And a big virtual hand clap to all the presentations. This was great. So this concludes the presentation portion